Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section we're going to look at the critical path. In the preceding section we saved a baseline for our wedding project, and now we're going to look at the critical path and what that is. The reason that I want to look at the critical path now is because as we start to track progress on a project, it's very often the case that things start to go a little bit wrong. For example, things get delayed, they take longer than expected, perhaps the costs increase or decrease, and at any point in time you may need to get back to a situation where you're saving time, you're making up for slippage on a project. And when you need to make up for slippage, what you really need to know is which tasks are really driving when this project is going to finish. The set of tasks that determine when a project is going to finish is called the critical path. It's the route you take to the end. And the tasks within the critical path are usually referred to as the critical tasks. So the first thing I'm going to do with the wedding project is to find out what our critical tasks are. Now, in order to do that in Gantt Chart view, if I go up to the Format ribbon, and in the bar styles group, you'll see one of the options there is a small checkbox called critical tasks. So I'm going to check that, and it will show on my chart all of the critical tasks in red. And note that also in the screen tip description as I hover over that critical tasks checkbox. So essentially the tasks highlighted in red on my Gantt chart here are the ones that actually determine when this project is going to be completed. Now sometimes, and particularly with a project with lots and lots of tasks in it, it's difficult to see the critical tasks. They might be spread out quite a bit, as are these. And there is a way of only showing the critical tasks. And in order to do that, we're going to look at another important aspect of views. So I'm going to jump back up to the View tab, and I'm going to apply a filter. And we did look at filters a little bit earlier on in the course. You'll find them in the data group. In the middle there we have filter. Now in this case, the filter I'm going to apply is called critical, and you'll see it, it's the fourth one down there in the list. And what that immediately does is it filters in only those critical tasks. So it makes them a lot easier for me to see in context of my project. Now it's quite often the case when you look at the critical path on a project that it is a continuous critical path. And what I mean by that is that for every day of the project, from the very beginning to the very end, there is at least one critical task happening. In this particular project, that's not actually the case. There are, I think, 3 significant gaps, and sometimes gaps are completely explicable. They're there for a good reason, no problem with them at all. Sometimes they can indicate that maybe there's a problem with the way that you have your project set up. So let's just take a quick look at a couple of the gaps here, just to give you an idea of how these things can occur. So I'm going to just zoom out ever so slightly so we get more of an idea of what's going on. And I'm going to look first at one towards the end. So this is the one that occupies quite a bit of October, and it's the gap after select honeymoon destination and book honeymoon, which is a critical task. And the wedding day itself, which itself is of course critical because it's the end, it's the last day of the project. Now the reason there's a gap there is because I set up the 21-day contingency. So that wedding day is going to be 21 days after the end of the preparation phase. And if you remember, if I drag this out very slightly, you can see here at the bottom, wedding day, 21 days after task 7, which is the preparation phase up here. Now, given the definition of what a critical task is, it's one that's happening that can't slip. There are no tasks occurring in that period, so none of them can be critical. So that's a perfectly legitimate gap in a critical path. The gap in the middle is largely down to the effects of resource leveling. And what can happen sometimes is that although we'll know one particular task has to be completed by a particular day, You can probably be reasonably flexible in the order in which you complete the tasks, subject to dependencies, constraints, etc. But basically, you just have a lot of work to do in the time, and resource leveling will sometimes cause gaps. Now, the first gap, the one that you see after agree, budget and approach, and the one before make reception venue shortlist, there is actually a task active there, which is making of the guest list. And there are dependencies on that, although the dependencies on making the guest list are based on its start date, not its end date, which will sometimes stop a task from being critical anyway. But the gap here is largely down to a combination of leveling and task prioritization as well. So in many ways, this particular project schedule is quite unusual. The critical path is quite unusual because of the number of gaps, but there are reasons for those gaps. And you'll tend to get gaps, for example, in projects where you have a lot of resource issues and also where there isn't a very definite sequence through the project. So what I'd like to do now is show you another way of looking at criticality of tasks. And first of all, I'm going to change the table that's in use here. So I'm going to change it back to an entry table. And I'm going to insert a column, and we've done this before. Right click, insert column. And the column I'm going to add is called finish slack. So again, these are in alphabetical order. So let's scroll down to finish, and there is finish slack. And what finish slack shows me is the slack, the amount by which any task can be delayed, its finish can be delayed, without affecting the end of a project. Now, it's interesting, for critical tasks, their finish slack is 0 days. And as you can see, all of these red tasks have a finish slack of 0 days. In fact, in Project 2019, you can change, if you like, this definition of critical and say, for example, that any task with 2 days or less, the finish slack is regarded as critical. We're not going to do that on this course. For the moment, we're going to stick with the standard definition that a task is critical if its finish slack is 0 days. That means that even if it was 1 day late, it would affect the end date of the project. Now let me remove that critical filter, and let's look at finish slack on all of the tasks. Now if you look at something like select wedding dress, that's got 48 days of finish slack. So that could be 48 days late. Bear in mind, various other tasks follow on after that, but it could be 48 days late without affecting the finish date of the whole project. And if you scroll through and have a look down at other tasks in the schedule, you'll see that all of the non-critical tasks have, in many cases, a significant amount of finish slack. Something else you might find useful as well, again, if I go to the Gantt Chart Tools, the Format tab, underneath the critical task checkbox in the bar styles group, there is a slack checkbox. And if you enable that, for each task you will see a visual indicator of its slack. So you'll see a line next to the non-critical tasks. And the slack also shows on the summary tasks. So again, you can see the line at the end of this summary task just here. So it gives a really good visual indicator of how much slack there is on individual tasks within your schedule. So in summation, in this section, we've looked at the critical path and critical tasks and at slack. A couple of other things to mention. If I go back to the Resource tab and go into Leveling Options, again, I mentioned this earlier on. There's an option in here, Level Only within available slack. If you click on Level Only within available slack, that does severely limit the amount of leveling that project is able to do, but it does also mean that you don't cause any delay. And secondly, if you need to shorten the project, possibly to deal with a delay during the running of the project, the place to start is with the critical path, because it's the critical tasks on the critical path that basically determine when a project is going to finish. That's it for the end of this section. In the next section, I'm going to set you exercise 6, so please join me for that.